Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody, and again apologize for this delay. Okay, so last week we completed chapter 6, which I call a transitional chapter, because it marks the transition from what we might call the mundane aspects of the Buddha's teaching to the supramundane or world-transcending aspect of his teaching. The fundamental purposes of the mundane aspect of the Buddha's teaching is first to show how to achieve well-being and happiness in this present life, that is in terms of our individual well-being as well as the well-being of the family, the community, and the whole society. And so the Buddha lays down a number of principles which are conducive to right livelihood, to proper relations within the family, between children and parents, between husband and wife. And he also lays down guidelines for the government, for the administration of a country, of a nation. So this is the aspect concerned with well-being and happiness here and now. The second broad domain of the Buddha's teaching is concerned with promoting or facilitating a fortunate or happy state of rebirth. And when we come to this aspect of the teaching, then we bring in the principle or law of karma and its fruit. And so we have to understand what is meant by unwholesome karma, what is meant by wholesome karma, what are the ways of action, ways of conduct to avoid, what are the ways of conduct to fulfill, to develop and fulfill. And even if we don't have a deep and detailed understanding, we still need a general understanding of the basic principles which govern the process of karmic causation. This is basically the principle that unwholesome actions, unwholesome karma will lead to pain and suffering, and particularly to an unfortunate or lower state of rebirth. Whereas wholesome karma, virtuous karma, will lead to well-being and happiness, and then will create good karma, good karmic potencies, which will lead to a fortunate or happy state of rebirth. And so the Buddha, when he was teaching a general audience, would always refer to, or often refer to, this working of the law of karma causation. And he would encourage people to perform deeds of wholesome karma, meritorious karma, so that by doing so they could guarantee themselves a fortunate state of rebirth and happiness and well-being in their future lives. However, just achieving a state of happiness here and now, or achieving a fortunate rebirth, this is not yet the final or ultimate aim of the Buddha's teaching. The ultimate aim is liberation, which means complete release from this whole process of karmic causation and repeated existence or cyclic existence. This is what is called samsara. Okay, so samsara is the process by which we take birth again and again in one realm of existence, another realm of existence, driven by our craving or attachment and our ignorance, lack of insight, lack of understanding, of true understanding. Samsara is also called in the text Punabhava. The word Punabhava means literally again becoming or repeated existence. And so this word signifies the repetitive or cyclic nature of samsaric existence, that we undergo birth, old age, sickness and death again and again. And so the ultimate aim of the Buddha's teaching is release from the samsaric process of samsaric becoming, or putting an end to repeated existence, repeated becoming. And in order to guide people away from attachment to their mundane well-being and to direct them to the supramundane or world-transcending goal, the Buddha in many discourses points out the shortcomings, the defects of the various aspects of cyclic existence. This is what we surveyed in chapter 6. The Buddha points out especially the dangers or shortcomings in sensual enjoyment, because what binds people to samsara again and again is the desire for the enjoyment of sensual pleasures. And so when the Buddha points out how sensual pleasures, when you look at them deeply and carefully, one sees that they don't really provide any kind of deep, lasting satisfaction. Then the Buddha points out the transience of life, that any lifespan is bound to end in death. And so no matter how much well-being, no matter how much security we might have, we can never protect ourselves from the ultimate insecurity. Even if one lives in a fortress maintained by troops and has different kinds of surveillance, spying on telephone calls, email communications, but the real enemy, the ultimate enemy, dwells within this very body, this very life, that is death. And so death will eventually catch up with us. Okay, so then, after showing the different drawbacks or shortcomings in cyclic existence, then the Buddha directs his followers to the world-transcending path, the way that leads to final liberation, to ultimate deliverance. And this is what we're going to come to today in chapter 7. Okay, but before we come to the actual constitution of the path itself, I have included here certain preliminary passages which address the question of why does one enter the Buddha's path? Why does one undertake this particular world-transcending training? The first passage, which I could title The Arrow of Birth, Aging and Death, revolves around a certain incident that occurred during the Buddha's teaching career involving a monk by the name of Malankya-Buddha. Now you see, during the Buddha's time, there were many philosophical questions which occupied the thoughts of the ascetics, the philosophers, the contemplatives, and most of the schools in the Buddha's time would adopt one or another answer to these speculative or metaphysical questions. And so the Buddhist texts condense these various speculative questions into a familiar set of 10 questions. This is the question whether the world is eternal or not eternal, whether the world is infinite or boundless in space or finite, spatially finite. Whether the soul is the same as the body, or whether the body is one thing, the soul is something else. Okay, so those are 6 questions. Then the next 4 questions revolve around the fate of the enlightened or liberated person after death. Does the liberated person continue to exist in some form after death? Does he completely stop or cease to exist? Does he both exist and not exist? Difficult position for us to understand. And does he neither exist nor not exist after death? Okay, and so when people would come to the Buddha seeking to understand his teaching, often they would try to probe into the Buddha's teaching by asking for his position in regard to these questions. So some would come to him and say, Venerable, is the world eternal or not eternal? Is it finite, infinite, and so on? Now there was one monk in the Buddha's time, this monk Malankaputta, who one day when he was alone, he was reflecting on the Buddha's teachings, and then suddenly he realized that even though he's been following the teaching for maybe for several months, the Buddha has never given specific, clear, concrete answers to these metaphysical questions. And apparently this monk was a kind of reflective type who would like to work out philosophical systems in his own mind. And so one day he decided, I just can't go on like this, following a teacher who leaves me completely in the dark regarding these metaphysical questions. So I'm going to go to the Buddha and lay down my demand. You give me clear-cut, definite answers to these questions, or else I'm going to leave you and maybe seek out some other teacher who will answer these questions. Okay, and so Malankaputta goes to the Buddha and presents his demand, saying, you give me a clear, definite answer to these questions. If you don't know the answer to these questions, then just be honest, be candid, have the humility to say, I don't know, I don't have the answers to these questions. Okay, so Malankaputta does this, and then the Buddha really hits him quite hard. He says, did I ever say to you, you come and follow me, and I'm going to answer and explain to you whether the world is eternal, not eternal, finite, infinite, and so on? And then this monk has to say, no. And then the Buddha illustrates the situation of this monk with the simile, which has become very famous. This is the simile of the poisoned arrow. He says that this is like a man who's been struck by a poisoned arrow, and the man falls to the ground. He's getting weaker, he's starting to lose clear consciousness, and then his parents or his relatives or friends see him hit by that arrow, and they call a surgeon to come to remove the arrow. And so the surgeon comes, he pulls out his scalpel and starts to approach the man to cut out and remove the arrow. But the man says, wait a minute, doctor. I'm not going to let you remove this arrow right away. Before you start cutting, you have to answer some questions for me. What was the name and clan of the man who shot me? Was he tall or short? Did he have dark skin or light skin? And then what was the material that the arrow was made of? What is the material that the feathers were made out of? What is the material that the arrowhead was made out of? Okay, and so he's demanding answers to all of these questions, and then the Buddha asks, what is going to happen to that man? If he doesn't let the surgeon pull out the arrow, but just insists on getting answers to these questions, that man is going to die, but before he gets answers to his questions. And so the Buddha says, if anyone should come to me and say, I will not lead this spiritual life under you until you answer these questions for me, those questions would still remain unanswered, but this person would die. And then the Buddha says, whether there is the view that the world is eternal, the spiritual life, the holy life cannot be lived. If there is the view the world is not eternal, any of these views, the spiritual life cannot be lived. And then the Buddha says, whether the world is eternal or not eternal, still there is birth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection and despair. And I teach the doctrine, the Dhamma, for eliminating these right here and now. Okay, and so the Buddha then goes on and then he says that he hasn't answered these questions, given answers to these questions, because to answer is unbeneficial. These questions don't lead to enlightenment or to liberation, to Nibbana. And then the Buddha lays down what he has declared, which are the Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, its origin, cessation, and the path. Okay, now somebody on reading this might think, it seems that the Buddha is contradicting himself, since earlier we learned that the Buddha says that this samsara is without any discoverable beginning. No point can be found no first point can be found to living beings roaming and wandering from one life to the next life. And so if that's the case, then shouldn't the Buddha say openly, directly, that this world is eternal? It's an interesting and difficult question, and I've never seen that question actually addressed within the text themselves. But the way I would answer it, I'd say a lot hinges on this particular expression that's used to indicate the beginningless nature of samsara. It literally means anamatagas. Yeah, the sense of this is that samsara is without any conceivable or discoverable first point. So this shifts the emphasis from a quest for an objective answer to the question, is the world eternal or not eternal? And it makes it a matter of subjective experience. That is, no matter how far back one goes in time, one never discovers a first point. And the reason that one never discovers a first point is because the causation of this process of rebirth lies within ourselves. It's not that there's some objective world out there independent of us in which we just happen to be situated. But rather, this world in which we're existing is in a way a reflection of our own minds. And it's our own ignorance and craving, as well as our volitional action, which keep us moving from life to life. And so the underlying causal mechanism that sustains the process of rebirth, of rebecoming, lies within ourselves. And thus, no matter how far back we might go, we always find ourselves in earlier lives being driven on by ignorance and craving. But the question whether the world is eternal or not seems to be presupposing that there's an objective, independently existing world. And we could trace back and then find either some first point for that world, or else we have to conclude that the world is without a beginning. And then the question whether the soul is the same as the body, or whether the soul is one thing and the body is another. Maybe if you're familiar with the Buddha's teaching of rebirth, then you might assume that there has to be a soul which undergoes rebirth. But according to the Buddha's teaching, there's no permanent soul, no individual self that undergoes rebirth. But rebirth is just a process of becoming, which continues from life to life. And so what undergoes the process of rebirth is the stream of consciousness, the stream of mental processes. But the stream of mental processes is not an individual soul which always remains the same. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask if there's any questions that arise out of this sutta, the Malankya-Putta Sutta.
Thank you. Then what is it or who is it that experiences this rebirth?
Okay, the question is, who is it or what is it that experiences this rebirth? Okay, maybe the way to approach and answer to that question is first, instead of asking who or what is it that experiences the rebirth, just focus on this present life. Who or what is it that undergoes experience in this present life? Like we normally think that there's some kind of self at the center of our experience, and that the self preserves its identity from birth all the way through growth, aging, till death. And so we think that there is this individual self which always remains the same self. According to the Buddha's teaching, this individual self is an illusion or a delusion. What we call the self is just a convenient term referring to a process or a set of processes that's always changing. So from moment to moment, first from birth to death, and even from moment to moment, our experience is always changing. And what is occurring is the arising of consciousness based upon a sense faculty, a sense object. And along with consciousness, a number of other factors come together so that we have a feeling, perception. We respond to the input of consciousness, that's volition. And then the consciousness is the awareness of it. And so we have these factors coming together. At each moment, these factors are arising together, and then the next moment, these factors are passing away. But when they pass away, they give rise to a new moment of experience, which again involves these same factors: the body, a consciousness arising based on the body, and along with consciousness, feeling, perception, and volitions, and then various emotions, decisions, and so on. So they're all bound together, always changing from moment to moment. But because of this deep-rooted ignorance, a lack of true understanding, we don't see this process of experience. We don't see experience as a process which is constantly changing, arising and passing away. But rather it appears to us to be the experience of a lasting self, an enduring self, something that we could take as being my true essence, my true I. Okay, and normally we assume that this I will last from birth to death, and then if we accept the idea of rebirth, we think that there must be a self, the same self, that passes on to the next life. So that is how the idea of a permanent or lasting soul arises. Now, according to the Buddha's teaching, when death takes place, this process of experience doesn't come to an end. It's just that the body, this physical body, has ceased to function as a suitable basis for the process of experience to occur. But within the stream of consciousness, as long as there is craving for more existence, craving to go on within this cyclic existence, then when this body ceases to function, the stream of consciousness will grasp on to another physical body, one which is just coming into being, and that will mark the moment of conception, and then the embryo will develop, and birth will take place, and then a new life will begin. And so it's this process of ever-changing factors of experience which goes on from life to life. Okay.
Now, it seemed to me that in this sutta, the Buddha has two reasons for not pursuing these metaphysical questions, and one of which is that it's simply beside the point of the die, and might get an answer. But then in point number 6, and I think you largely answered this, but I'm not sure, I want to read this. And it says, if there is a view the world is not eternal, the spiritual life cannot be lived. So he's saying here that if you adopt these views, one way or the other, they're simply obstacles. And I guess that relates to your earlier point that the rebirth is really within our own mind. The rebirth is within our own mind. Not look for it within a separate objective universe.
There are actually two reasons why the Buddha refuses to give answers to these metaphysical questions. One of them, which seems to be the main point of this sutta, is that the search for answers to these metaphysical questions comes from a kind of curiosity, the need to have fixed answers, to have some kind of comfortable conceptual system, and then it's not the aim of the Buddha's teaching just to provide a comfortable conceptual system, but the aim of the Buddha's teaching is a practical one of providing a path to liberation from birth, old age, sickness, and death. And so when I was in college and graduate school, I was a philosophy major, so I know the particular temperament of people that get wrapped up in questions like this. It's the kind of mind which needs to have a fixed system in which to dwell. And so this type of person will always be pondering these inscrutable questions, trying to work out a conceptual answer to them. And so when one gets into a mindset like that, then it discourages any kind of interest and earnest practice aimed at a practical end, which is liberation. Okay, so this is one reason why the Buddha refuses to give answers to these questions, because the concern with them is a kind of symptom of, we call this metaphysical curiosity, rather than a drive or an urge for true enlightenment and liberation. But there's another reason why the Buddha doesn't answer these questions. It's not clear from this sutta itself, but it comes out from other suttas within the collection, within the Nikayas. And this is because all of these questions really revolve around some assumption of a truly existing self. Like the question whether the world is eternal or not eternal presupposes that I am a self here confronting an objective world out there. And so it rests on this presupposition of a duality between self and the world. Similarly, the question whether the world is infinite or finite. Both of those answers to the question, both of those positions become untenable, because let us suppose one could travel to the far bounds of the universe. One would still be bringing one's sense faculties with one, and one's sense faculties would necessarily reveal something lying beyond them. So it would seem that the universe is boundless, but in order to declare that the universe is boundless, one would have to keep on traveling and traveling and traveling to the point that one could confirm that it's boundless, but one could never travel over an infinite distance. And so that alternative becomes impossible. Then the alternative, whether the soul is the same as the body or different from the body, both of these hinge on some kind of view of self. On one side, one is assuming the soul is a self separate from the body. With the other position, one is simply identifying the self with the body. And so one is adopting a materialist view. And then these views about the Tathagata, the enlightened person, whether he exists after death or not, all of those are assuming that the Tathagata, the enlightened person, exists as a self. And so one is asking, does this self of the enlightened person exist forever? That would be an eternalist view. Or is the self of the Tathagata, the enlightened person, something annihilated with his passing away?
Thank you.
Okay, there was some other question, I think, back. I saw another hand up.
I think I'd like to ask you probably maybe two questions. One, and I think they could both be these annoying, unbeneficial questions, but I feel compelled to ask them. The first one is, in a sense, I think we would have presented a type of metaphysical system himself, in the sense that it had teachings about what's, if we construe metaphysics as what's above, immediately perceptible to normal people,
Yeah.
teachings about the nature of being, of the self,
Yeah.
of time, etc.
Yeah.
Could we say he's presented it's a metaphysical system in that sense, and he doesn't want to go on an endless discussion. He wants to use it as a starting point for the teaching of the path.
Yeah.
But the teachings themselves are not apparent to normal, unenlightened people, and in that sense it has similarities to a metaphysical system.
Mm.
He just doesn't want to go on an endless discussion, but he's presented something that's metaphysical. And my other question, the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago, it's a very different world.
Yeah.
If he were here today and confronted by evolution, which would seem to teach that there is some sort of objective world, because the world has existed for 5 or 6 billion years.
Yeah.
For most of the time, there were no sentient, what in Buddhism we would call sentient beings.
Yeah.
So that they were viruses
Yeah.
that occurred
Yeah.
plants, dinosaurs, people.
Yeah.
the world thought to have existed before sentient beings, and if all sentient beings were removed from the world today, according to science, the world would in fact go on.
Yeah.
So if Buddha were alive today, he actually said something like, there is a physical world that exists prior to and could exist after any sort of mental
Okay.
beings.
Okay. Okay.
So there would be an objective world in some sense.
Okay. Let me take these questions individually. Okay. The first question is whether the Buddha actually taught some kind of metaphysical system, but he just didn't want to go on in sort of endless discussions about them because he was using this metaphysical system as a starting point, or let's say a foundation for spiritual practice. I think definitely it's true that the Buddha taught principles which are not immediately verifiable by us. If one wants to call these metaphysical or not, it's just a matter of choice of terminology. But I think what the Buddha would say is that first, there are principles which I have discovered and realized for myself through direct knowledge. So that what I'm teaching is not a metaphysical system in the sense of a speculative system, something that I've just devised through reflection, through conceptual construction. But he's teaching what he has discovered through his enlightenment. And what he's discovered through his enlightenment includes the principles, the workings of certain laws which are, again, not visible to us. The law of karma, different realms of existence in which rebirth can take place. And so the Buddha says that these are facts, the truths that I've discovered through experience. And then the Buddha also says that these facts are not beyond the scope of discovery by other persons who develop their faculties in the appropriate way. Just to use an analogy, if a scientist says that this room is filled with billions and billions of living beings that we cannot see, then at one level you might say, this man is just creating a speculative system, an imaginary system. But if he brings us to a powerful microscope and then lets us see on the slide some specimen that he's taken from the room, then we can see that there are many bacteria, billions of bacteria, even on a single slide. And so when we develop our faculties in the appropriate way, in this case by using the microscope, we can see things that are beyond the range of our normal vision. And so the Buddha says that there are these principles, this law of karma, these different realms of rebirth into which consciousness can be reborn. And if one practices this path, and if one is so inclined, it's not necessary, but if one is so inclined, one can develop the special faculties of divine eye in order to see one's own past existences and to see other beings moving from life to life through the round of rebirth. Okay, so these principles are also they're not just presented as part of a speculative philosophical system just to satisfy curiosity, but this is all forming the structure, let us say, the very extensive, complex structure of the first and second noble truths. They show the cosmic dimensions of the truth of suffering and the very deep inner dynamics of the causation of suffering. Okay, so this is the answer to the first question. We come to the second question, which is, okay, the Buddha was living 2,500 years ago. He didn't have the facts of evolution available to him. If he were living today and he were presented with the modern cosmology, geology, the story of the earth, and learn that there were periods of the history of the earth when it wasn't occupied by sentient beings, periods in the history of this galaxy, solar system, this galaxy, even the whole universe when there are no sentient beings available, then would that change his perspective on the nature of the world? Is that stating the question correctly?
More or less. Just essentially when we say there is a world that can exist without sentient beings.
Yeah. Actually, the Buddha does teach that there are periods when the world exists without sentient beings occupying it in the way we know it today. In the Buddhist cosmology, the universe or world system goes through 4 stages of development. Okay, there's the stage of maybe we could call this evolution or unfolding. It's not the biological evolution as such, but a stage of unfolding, expansion, world expansion, where the universe expands till it reaches some maximum point of expansion. Then it starts to, then once it reaches that maximum point of expansion, it remains in that state for a certain period of time. So that is the second phase. We call this stability of expansion. Then it goes to the third stage, which is the stage of contraction, till it contracts completely into a very minute bundle of completely decompressed, or completely compressed matter. And then it remains in that state of compression for a certain period of time. That's the stability of contraction. And then it starts to expand again. And so basically it's expansion, contraction, with periods of stability or rest in between these alternating stages. Okay, during the stage of expansion at the beginning, there are no sentient beings occupying this particular plane of existence. But Buddhism teaches that there are different planes of existence, not only the plane at which this physical universe exists. So during the time when the universe becomes, or this world system becomes, unoccupiable by conscious living beings, all of the beings who had been dwelling in it previously have migrated to some other plane of existence. And they remain in that plane until the world starts to evolve again, till it starts to expand. Then when it reaches a suitable degree of expansion, then the beings start to descend from these other planes of existence and then come back into this world. And so, when I speak about the world as not being objective, perhaps I have to avoid that particular expression. The world does have a certain objectivity apart from our consciousness, but it's just that our consciousness and our conscious functions are intimately connected with the development of the world, with the presence of the world. But we shouldn't think that this means that the world is just a subjective projection of consciousness, which is not the case according to the Buddha's teaching. Okay, I think I want to continue now. Oh, do you have some questions?
Basically what you said, I mean, then how does one account for biases and things like that? How does one account for biases and the fact that one's, life started in the water and then grew, and what I understand about evolution, we came into being because of evolution. So I'm not quite clear as to the progression.
Okay.
I mean, we got a bias and then we ourselves kept developing, and we became what we did.
Okay, what Buddhism would say is that, first, Buddhism doesn't explicitly address the question of evolution, because the facts of evolution were not known during the Buddha's time. So what I would do is give my understanding of how Buddhism would square its own teachings with the fact of evolution. Okay, during the period, let's say, before evolution has reached a point where human beings have existed, those beings who have basically a human level of consciousness, a developed level of consciousness, would be existing in some other realm of existence. And then when evolution advances to the point where human beings can start to arise, then the beings who are living in these other realms of existence would pass away there, and then their consciousness would migrate into the human beings who are emerging on the earth. Does that answer the question?
It in a way does, but
Yeah.
at the same time when I'm asking myself, what about, the ants and all the other life? How does that fit in?
Let us say that I myself, I don't know where, at what point in the animal kingdom one has beings with streams of consciousness that migrate from life to life. I'm not sure at what point that begins. I'm doubtful that bacteria migrate from life to life. Whether ants, insects, whether their types of consciousness will transmigrate from life to life, this is something I'm unsure of. But what I would say, certainly at the level of mammals, we have beings with a consciousness which has reached a sufficient degree of development that we could see that the consciousness of a mammal has some nucleus of personal identity. And so my conjecture is that mammals are certainly involved in the process of rebirth, moving from life to life.
And the rest of them then, it was just they came and they went and...
This is my speculation. There's no pronouncement in the Buddhist text about this.
Connected to this is that, given the fact that the Buddha, had access to all knowledge, wouldn't he have known that? And the other thing is that I took a class with Masaru Bhikkhu, and he said, of course, he said there is no original nature, so we are actually moving forward. And I really didn't understand that in the class, with the workshop ended.
Yeah.
So, all of this is kind of connected to the whole evolution.
What Buddhism would say is that it's not necessarily the case that we're moving forward. And I don't think Venerable Thanissaro would have said that either. Because where we as individuals move to within the cycle of rebirth depends upon our own willed actions, our karma.
Yes,
Yeah.
you say that. But
Yeah.
you said that nonetheless it's not that we knew ourselves before and that we had an original nature. You have to work towards understanding that nature.
Yeah.
In that sense, it's a movement forward. If it is, if you work at it.
Okay, basically one has to make the personal effort to move forward. If one doesn't make the personal effort to move forward, then one moves downward or backwards.
Right.
So it depends on one's actions.
Yes, I understand that, but what I'm saying is that if we didn't have an original nature, then the condition of unbinding is something that we discover for the first time, or is it something that we had before? Anyway,
I think these questions are getting too far away from the subject matter. So let us just go back to the text. It's getting a little bit to be like the person who's wounded by the arrow. Okay, so let's go on now. The next text is also concerned with the fundamental reason for leading the spiritual life under the Buddha. But this text takes that question from a somewhat different angle. Here the Buddha is discussing how a person who sets out on the path to liberation can go astray by settling for lesser attainments. And it's significant that the Buddha spoke this discourse, it says in the introduction, or in the first paragraph, it says that the Buddha spoke this soon after Devadatta had left. Now, who is Devadatta? Devadatta was the Buddha's cousin. And when the Buddha came back to his home city, Kapilavatthu, and taught the members of his family, then a number of the young men were inspired by the Buddha's discourses, by the Buddha's personality, and they decided to go forth and become ordained as monks under the Buddha. And then one of them who went forth was Devadatta. And I don't know the real actual facts about Devadatta's life, but in the Buddhist text, he becomes depicted as the chief villain in the drama of the Buddha's life story. It seems to make any biography exciting and absorbing. One needs a villain to stand up against the hero. Superman has, who is his villain? I mean, these...
Lex Luthor.
Is it Luthor?
Yes, Lex Luthor.
Lex Luthor. I haven't read Superman comics since 12 years old or so. And Batman has who? The Joker? And Robin Hood has his villain, I think.
Sheriff of Nottingham. The Sheriff of Nottingham.
Sheriff of Nottingham. Wow, you're good.
I'm familiar with lots of villains.
Okay, so within the Buddha story, the Buddha biography, Devadatta becomes his nemesis. And Devadatta, after becoming a monk, perhaps in the early stages, he practiced quite earnestly, and then he gained various states of samadhi or deep meditation. And then based on this deep meditation, he was able to gain spiritual powers, psychic powers. And he became obsessed with these psychic powers and thought that he could use them in order to gain control of the Sangha. He wanted to take over control of the Sangha. And so when the Buddha reaches his old age, then Devadatta tried to persuade the Buddha to turn control of the Sangha over to himself. He told the Buddha, "You are old now, you're weak, you've lost your vigor, so this is time for you to retire. We build a nice hut for you, we provide you with your meals, you can meditate peacefully. You don't have to be concerned with teaching the monks, the nuns, the lay people. Let me do that, I can do it well." Okay, but the Buddha knew Devadatta's corrupt character and his ambition. And so the Buddha refused to turn over the Sangha to Devadatta. Then Devadatta used his psychic powers to win the favor of the prince of the state of Magadha, the largest state in northern India. And so then Devadatta won the support of the prince, and he tried to use his royal support in order to overthrow the Buddha. But he failed in that attempt. And so finally, Devadatta decided, I'm going to split off from the Buddha and establish my own religion, my own Sangha, with myself as the Buddha. Okay, so this is what is being referred to as soon after Devadatta had left. After Devadatta split off from the Buddha in order to establish his own monastic order. Okay, and so now the Buddha explains that there are some clansmen, this you could take to be a young man, who goes forth out of faith from the home life, the household life, into homelessness, thinking, I am a victim of birth, aging and death, of sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection and despair. I am a victim of suffering, a prey to suffering. Surely an ending of this whole mass of suffering can be known. Okay, when he goes forth, then he acquires gain, honor and renown. This is because in India during the Buddha's time, the monastics were supported by the lay community. And so it could be that if this monk is living close to an area where there are very wealthy people, he might be a good preacher and lecturer. He might have very good manners, and so he inspires people. And then people come to admire him, and then he gets a good reputation. People provide him with a lot of support. And so he gets this gain, honor, and renown. Okay, then what happens is that he becomes pleased or he's satisfied with that gain, honor, and renown. And then his intention is fulfilled. That is, he doesn't make any effort to go further, to develop the practice further. But he just becomes attached to his status as an admired, respected, revered, well-known monk. And then he disparages others. He looks down upon the other monks who don't get this honor, respect, and veneration. And when this happens, then he falls into negligence and gives up striving further. And so now the Buddha uses a simile to describe this person. He says it's like a person who is needing hotwood, seeking hotwood, wandering in search of hotwood. Now in India during the Buddha's time, if, for example, one needed some article of furniture, generally one didn't go to a furniture shop and buy a table or a chair. Maybe in big cities there were furniture shops, but in the towns and villages, people would make their own furniture. And so if somebody needs some article like a table, a chair, they would go into the woods, cut down a tree, and then they would cut away the rest of the tree and take the heartwood. The heartwood is the solid core of the tree. Okay, so now we have a person who wants to make some wooden article. And so he goes searching for the heartwood. He comes to a tree. He cuts down the tree. But then he doesn't go digging it or cutting into the tree to get the heartwood, but rather he just takes the twigs and leaves and goes away with them, thinking this is the heartwood. And so if somebody were to see him, to see what he's doing, that person would think that this is a foolish man, since he's neglected to strike down deep and to take the heartwood, but rather he's just cut off the twigs and leaves and taken them away. And then whatever this person wants to construct, whether a table, chair, platform, wall, roof, whatever, his purpose will not be fulfilled. And so the Buddha then says that this monk, the one who is satisfied with gain and honor, this is called one who has taken the twigs and leaves of the spiritual life and stopped short with that. Okay, in the next case, the Buddha is going to go through successively higher achievements. We have a monk who goes forth with the same intention. He gains, or he acquires gain, honor, and renown, but he doesn't remain satisfied with that gain, honor, and renown. His intention is not fulfilled. He doesn't praise himself and disparage others, but he perfects his conduct, his moral discipline. And then when he perfects his moral conduct, observing all of the precepts very scrupulously, then he becomes pleased with that attainment. And then his intention is fulfilled. He doesn't try to go any further, but he thinks, I have pure conduct, that much is enough. And then when he sees other monks who are not observing the precepts, whose conduct might be blameworthy, then he looks down upon them and criticizes them. And so he becomes satisfied with his pure conduct and disparages the other monks. And in this way he falls into negligence. And then the Buddha compares this person to the man who's gone out in quest of heartwood. And this person, he cuts off the twigs and the leaves, but when he comes to the outer bark, he cuts off the bark, thinking, this will serve my purpose. And so if somebody is seeing him, he realizes this is a foolish man, and whatever object he has to make with the heartwood, he won't be able to make with the outer bark. Okay, in the third case, we have somebody who goes forth and becomes a monk, wishing to make an end of suffering. He gains honor and he acquires honor and renown, but he's not pleased with that. He perfects his moral discipline, but he doesn't remain complacent with that. But he goes on to practice concentration or samadhi. And through the practice of meditation, he's able to gain samadhi, very deep meditative absorption. And at that point, he becomes pleased and satisfied. He delights in this meditative absorption. He could spend long periods sitting with a very quiet, peaceful mind, experiencing bliss, joy, equanimity. And so then he becomes satisfied. He becomes gratified with that samadhi. And then when he sees other monks who are not so diligent and meditative, then he thinks, I am one who is concentrated. I'm a real meditator. But these other monks who are busy with doing some work for the Sangha, looking after the facilities and so on, these are scattered-minded. Their minds are going astray. And so then he becomes complacent about his attainment of samadhi, and then he becomes negligent. He doesn't make any attempt to go further. And the Buddha compares this man, or this monk, to a man who goes in search of heartwood, and then he passes by the twigs and the outer bark, but he takes the inner bark, removes the inner bark and takes it away, thinking I can use this inner bark to construct my furniture. But again, this man shows that he doesn't understand the proper nature of heartwood. And the Buddha compares this man to the one who's intoxicated with the attainment of samadhi or concentration. The next case, now we come to the fourth case, we have somebody who goes forth seeking an end of suffering. He doesn't become complacent over gain, honor, and renown. He doesn't become complacent over purified moral discipline. He gains samadhi, but he doesn't become complacent over his attainment of samadhi. And then he achieves what is called knowledge and vision. Now the use of this term here, for me, it's a little puzzling, because knowledge and vision is usually held up or held in very high esteem in the Buddha's teaching. Sometimes it's even presented as the goal of the practice is to achieve knowledge and vision. But the commentary gives an explanation which could be correct here. the commentary explains that what is meant by knowledge and vision here is not higher enlightenment, but it's rather the knowledge and vision that makes possible psychic powers or spiritual powers. So this would be the knowledge and vision that would allow one, for example, to recollect one's previous lives, the knowledge and vision that might enable one to see different realms of existence, the knowledge and vision that might enable one to perform what are called the feats of supernormal power, like appearing in different places at the same time. Being able to read the minds of others, being able to pass through solid objects without being hindered by them, being able to walk on water without sinking in. Okay, so these are different types of psychic powers that come from this knowledge and vision. And this seems to have been what happened with the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta. He gained this knowledge and vision, this ability to exercise spiritual powers, and then he became attached to them and thought he could set himself up as a rival to the Buddha. Okay, so when this monk achieves knowledge and vision, then he looks down at the other monks who do not achieve knowledge and vision. And then the Buddha compares this to the man who goes seeking heartwood, and then he cuts off the sapwood, that's the soft wood, and takes it away thinking it's the heartwood. The softwood is getting close, but the softwood will not function as effectively as heartwood in constructing some object of furniture. And so the Buddha says that the monk who becomes intoxicated with knowledge and vision, this monk is called one who has taken the sapwood of the spiritual life and stopped short with that. Okay, now in the next case, the Buddha takes the person who goes forth into the homeless life. He might acquire gain, honor, and renown, but he's not satisfied with that. He perfects his moral discipline, but he's not satisfied with that. He gains concentration, but he's not satisfied with that. He develops knowledge and vision, but he's not satisfied with that. And then being diligent, he attains what's called perpetual or continual, unshaken emancipation. And then the Buddha says it's impossible for that monk to fall away from this perpetual liberation. So this means the complete, perfect liberation. And then the Buddha compares this monk to a man who goes seeking heartwood. He goes into the forest and he cuts away the twigs and leaves, strips the outer bark, strips the inner bark, cuts off the softwood, and then he comes to the heartwood at the core of the tree. And then he takes that heartwood away and uses it to construct the object that he wants to make with heartwood. And so in this case, that man's purpose will be served. And the Buddha says, so it is with this monk who attains perpetual liberation. And then the Buddha sums up the point of this discourse in the last paragraph. He says that this spiritual life does not have gain, honor, and renown for its benefit, or the attainment of perfection of moral discipline, or the attainment of samadhi, concentration, nor does it have this knowledge and vision for its benefit. But it is this unshakable liberation of mind that is the goal of the spiritual life, its heartwood and its end. Okay, maybe from this we could just go into the short passage that comes on the next page, which also spells out the aim of the spiritual life, the higher spiritual life. Here the Buddha addresses the monks and he says, if wanderers of other sects ask you for what purpose is the spiritual life lived under the ascetic Gautama, that's under the Buddha. Often when the monks were wandering, they would meet ascetics from the other sects and then they would have discussions with them. And very often the discussion would begin with the question, what is the goal of your teaching? Why have you left the household life to go forth? What is the aim of your practice? So now the Buddha is giving the monks some kind of cue as to how they should respond to this question. Okay, so the Buddha says, if wanderers of other sects ask you, for what purpose is the spiritual life lived under the ascetic Gautama, then you should reply, it is for the fading away of lust, the ending of craving, that the spiritual life is lived under the Blessed One. And this phrase here, the fading away of lust, is somewhat interesting in the original language. You have the word raga, which is translated lust or sometimes attachment, comes from a root which means to dye. Not in the sense of to pass away, but to dye a cloth, a particular color. I think the root is runge. So in India at that time, in the cities, there would be shops which specialized in dyeing cloth, and the dyer is called a rajaka, based on the same root. And the word raga then means a color, the color that's used for dyeing the cloth. And this word raga, it also comes to be used in Indian music for a particular theme on which a musician improvises. This is because each of these basic melodic themes that are used, each of these melodic themes which is used as a basis for improvisation, is intended to suggest a particular mood, a particular flavor, and that mood or flavor is the color of that particular melody, a particular melodic scale, which is the basis for the improvised piece, which is called a raga. That's in Indian classical music. And so the Buddha, and probably other teachers in this period, used this word raga, literally meaning color, to signify lust or craving, because the mind is seen as being in its own nature pure and bright and luminous, but when lust arises in the mind, then it sheds a particular color over the mind, which blots out that intrinsic luminosity. And then the word viraga is generally used to mean the ending of lust, or sometimes we could translate it dispassion. And so viraga means the fading away. When something loses its color, it fades away and then it becomes white again. A cloth that has been dyed. Nowadays we have these laundry fast dyes are used to color cloths, so the cloth never loses its color. But I know in Asia, the monk's robes that we used back in the old days, we would sometimes dye them ourselves, or they would be used with these cheap commercial dyes, which would not color fast. And so after we washed them over again and again, maybe over a year or a couple of years, the color is fading out. Actually, with each washing, we could see so much of the dye gets washed away, until after a couple of years, the cloth is almost white again. Okay, and so this is the fading out, fading away of this color of the mind, which is lust. Okay, and so one of the goals, or one of the ways in which the Buddha frames the goal of the spiritual life is the fading away of lust. Okay, and then if the wanderer is asked, is there a path for the fading away of lust? Then the monk should reply, there is a path, and that is the Noble Eightfold Path. We'll come to that in our next class. Okay, then the Buddha gives a number of other answers to this question, what is the goal of the spiritual life? Another answer, it is for the abandoning of the fetters. Okay, in various suttas, the Buddha speaks about 10 fetters that keep one bound to the cycle of becoming, the cycle of rebirth. I won't enumerate the fetters now, we'll come to them in a later chapter. But what he lays down here is that the spiritual life is lived for cutting off or eradicating these fetters. Another goal is for the uprooting of the underlying tendencies of the deep, latent tendencies to the defilements. And so, in unenlightened beings, these underlying tendencies follow along with the stream of consciousness from life to life. And to gain liberation, these underlying tendencies have to be eliminated, uprooted. Another way the goal is formulated, for the full understanding of the Course. The Course means this process of becoming, this process of samsara. And so this whole process has to be fully understood by examining it and investigating it with the focused mind and then penetrating it with wisdom. Some other ways of formulating the goal for the destruction of the taints. The taints are 3 very fundamental defilements. Craving for sensual pleasures, craving for continued becoming, and ignorance. And so the aim of the Buddha's teaching is to eliminate or eradicate these 3 taints. Another way of expressing the goal is for the realization of true knowledge and liberation. Another way, and this is an interesting expression, is for the sake of knowledge and vision. Here we have knowledge and vision used in a positive sense, whereas in the previous sutta, we had knowledge and vision used in the sense of a tentative goal, but not the final goal. So the expression knowledge and vision has to be used with different nuances in the two passages. Okay, and then finally, as the goal for the spiritual life, we have for the sake of final nibbana without clinging. For the sake of this, the spiritual life is lived under the Buddha. And then the wanderers ask, is there a path for attaining final nibbana without clinging? And again, the answer is that it is the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, at this point I'll ask whether there are any questions on anything in the previous sutta, the one on the simile of the heartwood, or on this passage that we've just gone through. Okay, go away.
I still need a bit of clarification about the term of it for the sake of the knowledge and vision. Does this term usually refer to the attainment of the first level, extreme entry?
Okay, the question, does the expression knowledge and vision usually refer to the attainment of stream entry? In my opinion, knowledge and vision doesn't refer specifically to the first level, the level of stream entry. The way knowledge and vision is used in the text, usually it refers to the attainment of insight knowledge. So it's an early stage of wisdom or insight knowledge. When it's used in that sense, it's usually qualified as yatha bhuta jnana dassana, knowledge and vision of things as they really are. When we have that expression, it's insight knowledge, which is building up to higher stages of realization. It's still part of the path. Then we have, in a second sense, knowledge and vision used in the sense in which it's used in the previous sutta, as the knowledge and vision which provides the basis for the spiritual powers, the psychic powers. And then occasionally we have knowledge and vision used in the sense, I would say, the final knowledge and vision, the ultimate wisdom. And that is the sense in which it's being used here in this passage, as the goal for which the spiritual life is lived under the Buddha.
Then isn't it possible that for a person who attains a higher state of knowledge and vision to feel complacent about awakening himself and then stop short of the final?
Okay, is it possible for a person who achieves higher knowledge and vision to become complacent? You mean knowledge and vision in the sense of insight knowledge?
Right.
Yeah, that is definitely the case, that a person can become complacent over this knowledge and vision in the sense of insight knowledge. And then one just becomes satisfied with that particular level of insight knowledge and doesn't make an effort to go further. But in interpreting the sutta on the heartwood, I mean, it occurred to me that it might be intended in that sense also. But the reason that inclined me to go along with the commentarial explanation is that the first paragraph, the introductory paragraph of the sutta, says that the Buddha spoke it shortly after Devadatta had left. So it occurred to me that maybe the commentary is right because the Buddha had Devadatta in mind when he spoke the sutta. And so he meant knowledge and vision in the sense of the knowledge and vision that enables one to exercise the psychic powers. We can't really be 100% sure because there's no further explanation of the term here.
Did Devadatta attend the high stage of knowledge and vision according to the sutta?
By the higher stage of knowledge and vision,
Yeah. Did Devadatta attend that stage?
you mean the ultimate knowledge?
The ultimate, the first level, the higher knowledge, the higher stage, not the psychic powers. Did Devadatta achieve that?
Any kind of insight knowledge? The texts don't say anything about him doing that. It's possible. Excuse me?
How about other sutras?
Other sutras. No, I'm speaking about collectively. There's no sutra which speaks about him gaining insight knowledges. No sutra to my knowledge. And he didn't attain certainly he didn't attain the final ultimate knowledge and wisdom, knowledge and vision, because he passed away. He actually committed two of the what are called the heinous offenses, the terrible offenses, which have as their result of rebirth in hell. That is, with a malicious mind, he wounded the Buddha. He hurled a rock from the top of the mountain, hoping that the rock would fall, a big boulder would fall and crush the Buddha and kill the Buddha. That didn't happen, but a splint split off from that big boulder, and it flew and it hit the Buddha in the leg and it wounded the Buddha's leg. And so this was deliberately, maliciously wounding the Buddha. And then he divided the Sangha. He caused a schism in the Sangha by leaving and taking 500 or a large number of other monks with him. But the Buddha predicted that in some distant future life he will eventually achieve enlightenment. Okay, any further questions?
One thing about the Heartwood Sutta,
it suggests that people, I was so troubled at the end because it really can seem to me be read as an exhortation to go all the way. That there will be to go all the way to Nirvana.
Yeah.
And of course that would be wonderful, but it suggests that there is satisfaction at intermediate levels of achievement, moral discipline, and they can be gratifying and lead to complacency. But then the consequence is always continued suffering.
The consequence is always
there's continued suffering. So it would seem that built in to this path there would be the continued impetus for further striving, and that is you continue to confront suffering in your life. So I'm a little sorting this out and thinking. On the one hand, I find it a little dismaying to think that there will be suffering until Nirvana is achieved. But on the other hand, with that suffering, there is the impetus to continue achieving.
There is the what?
The impetus to continue achieving higher levels.
Okay.
But I'm wondering, what level of satisfaction should one appropriately feel at the intermediate levels?
Okay, this is a good question. Okay, let me just formulate the question so that it gets recorded. I have to see if I can get it, play it back as you intended. Okay, the text here, this is the simile of the heartwood speaks about feeling satisfaction as one reaches these preparatory attainments, and then one becomes complacent over that. One becomes satisfied with those lesser attainments, one becomes complacent, and then that causes further suffering. And so the question, and the text always has this emphasis upon striving to go further to reach the next level and not remaining satisfied till one reaches the final goal. So your question is, to what degree should one feel satisfied with these lesser achievements? I think one has to first take the sutta in context. In fact, one has to take all of the Buddha's discourses in context. But particularly relating to that point, one should understand this sutta in its proper context. That the Buddha here wants to lay down a sort of fixed principle of his teaching that the final goal is this perpetual, irreversible, unshakable liberation of the mind, and that nothing short of that is the final goal. Okay, now in context, one could assume that the Buddha would have known the basic mental proclivities and aptitudes of the people in his audience. And he would have known probably that a number of them have the potential to reach the ultimate goal if they make sufficient effort. And so what the Buddha's intention here is to discourage them from just settling down and becoming satisfied with some lesser degree of attainment. But he's not saying that if you feel any satisfaction with this lesser degree of attainment, that is something blameworthy in itself. In fact, in other suttas, the Buddha will speak about how as one achieves each lesser level of attainment, one experiences joy and happiness. And rather than reject that joy and happiness, then one should dwell on that and reinforce that joy and happiness. Because the joy and happiness that comes from even the lesser attainments, for example, observing the precepts carefully, that brings a kind of stability to the mind which serves as a platform for advancing to next level of achievement and then going on to still higher levels of achievement. So what I would say is that as one fulfills each preparatory level of achievement and experiences joy and happiness on that account, initially one should strengthen that joy and happiness. And then maybe one can reflect how previously I never experienced such joy and happiness before. And then strengthen that joy and happiness and then use that as encouragement to go further to the next level. And so then one can go on further and further and further. But at the same time, one should bear in mind the message of this sutta is that one should not settle down at any lesser degree of attainment and then think, now I've done it, now I've accomplished the goal of the Buddha's path, I don't have to go further. Rather, the message is, until one reaches that ultimate goal, the final liberation of the mind, then one shouldn't settle down and become satisfied. I hope that answers the question.
I would just say, did he say, slightly rephrase it a little bit, he's saying the final goal is Nibbana, but if one is skeptical of achieving Nibbana, he should not therefore be skeptical of pursuing the path.
Yeah.
And the intermediate stages themselves can, at each stage, be sufficiently rewarding, although one should not necessarily be complacent either.
Yeah.
But don't despair of reaching the ultimate goal.
Okay, this is a good and valuable point. That as one reaches satisfaction with each lesser level of attainment, even if one has some doubts about the ultimate goal, but still the satisfaction that one experiences will serve as a kind of encouragement and will strengthen one's confidence in the teaching and the practice and then serve as an encouragement to go further. Mm-hmm. Did you have a question here?
Yes, please.
I think it's good to get the microphone because then the people in the back can hear.
I would assume that one would realize the difference and realize when they achieve the ultimate goal.
Okay, this is a good question. His question is, he says, I assume that one would realize the difference and realize when one has achieved the ultimate goal. I'm afraid it isn't so easy. Because it's easy to become mistaken and think that one has achieved the ultimate goal when one hasn't. This is why it said that one should check with a teacher that one is confident has reached the goal, so that the teacher can sort of probe one's experience and then tell you whether one has reached the ultimate goal or not. In this respect, there's a story that comes from the commentaries about an incident in Sri Lanka. Centuries ago, there was a monk who was a well-known teacher, and he had many students, and he considered himself to have achieved arahatship, to have achieved liberation. And he had a pupil. The pupil's name was Dhammadina. And Dhammadina had become an arahant with psychic powers, with spiritual powers. The teacher had developed not only liberation, but he had developed spiritual powers as well. So he thought, I have this perfect purity of mind, these spiritual powers, so definitely I'm liberated, I'm an arhat. Then his pupil, Dhammadina, achieved arhatship with spiritual powers, including the power to read the mind of others. And so one time he was living at some distance from his teacher. He was now independent. And so he was sitting in meditation, and then he wondered, what has my teacher achieved? And so he used his own mind to examine his teacher's mind, and he saw that in his teacher, none of the defilements had been eradicated, that he hadn't reached any level of enlightenment, but he was just mistaken, he was overrating himself. But Dhammadina was in a somewhat uncomfortable situation, since in a traditional Buddhist culture, the teacher-student relationship is something which is governed by its very demanding code of etiquette, that the pupil cannot directly challenge the teacher and debunk a teacher's attainment. But Dhammadina realized, I have to do something to help my teacher. And so he went to his teacher, and then after the exchange of cordial greetings, he asked his teacher, when did you reach the final attainment? And the teacher said, 20 years ago, something like that. Then Dhammadina said, and you have the psychic powers also? The teacher said, yes, friend, I do. Then Dhammadina said, can you create an elephant? The teacher said, no problem. And a split second later, there was an elephant standing in front of them, some distance away, maybe 100 meters away. Then Dhammadina said, can you make this an elephant in rut? When the elephant is exuding this fluid, when it becomes quite irascible. So the teacher said, no problem. Then immediately the elephant started trumpeting, standing up on its hind legs, howling, yelling. Then Dhammadina said, can you make this elephant come running straight at us? The teacher said, no problem. A split second later, I have to use my psychic powers to stop that. seems during the week it takes about 3 seconds. On Saturday, it goes on for about half a minute. Okay, so Dhammadina asked the teacher, can you make that elephant come running straight at us? A split second later, the elephant comes running at them, trumpeting, howling, very fierce. The elephant is getting closer, closer, and closer. Then it's about 15 yards away. And then the teacher, suddenly his face turns white. And he becomes frightened. He turns around and starts to run away. Then Dhammadina grabs him by the robe and says, does an arhat have any fear? And then the teacher suddenly realizes that for 20 years he's been deluding himself. Then the happy ending to the story is that he then bows down to Dhammadina, the teacher bows down to his own student and says, please friend, help me. Then Dhammadina examines his teacher's previous practice, then explains to him where he went wrong and tells him how to practice correctly. And then the teacher goes off to his meditation room, meditates, and within, I think even the same day, he reaches liberation. Okay, we have to end now for today. The next class will be not next Saturday, but 2 Saturdays from now. This will be August 2nd, 9th, 16th, same time, 9:30. Okay, we'll end with the dedication of the merits. So we share the merits from listening to the Dhammas, speaking the Dhamma. We share it with the deities who protect the Dhamma, with the spirits, the fierce spirits, and with all other beings, asking them to protect the Dhamma in the world, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiran Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiran Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiran Rakantu Mankaram Etavata Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Deva Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavata Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavata Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Sata Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Avici Hetato Etantare Satakayupapanna Rupi Arupi Cha Asanya Sanvino Dukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Ni